this session, we're going to talk about location-dependent security. Now, location-dependent security differs from the security model we've been using in the rest of the videos. And this is the difference. Previously, we've been using location-independent security, which means that any privileges that an operator is granted are granted throughout the entire system. You can associate what someone's allowed to do, but they're allowed to do it anywhere. Now, with location-dependent security, you not only get to associate privileges with an operator, but you can also specify where those privileges can take place within the system. So you not only get to specify who gets to do what, but you also get to specify where they get to do it in the system. Now, in order to configure web control to use location-dependent security, you have to have the optional package Advanced Security installed with the system. This does not come with the base version of web control. The additional Advanced Security package is required. Now, assuming we have that installed, and in this system we do, we would configure location-dependent security on the System Settings Security tab. And before you change your security policy from independent to dependent or vice versa, you should always make a backup. We're going to make an irrevocable change to the database. There's not an undo when we change our security policy. So I always make a backup before I change. Now, I've done that before this exercise, so we're going to go ahead and change the policy by going to the security policy section and clicking Change Policy. Note that we're currently using location-independent security. So I will change this. It will require a system restart, and note that it tells you the operation cannot be undone, hence the need for a backup. Now we will have to restart the web control system, and we will do so now. And we're back. We rebooted the server, and now we're using location-dependent security policy. You can see that noted here. Now we can always switch back by pushing the button again, but any changes we've made in configuring these privilege sets under the location-dependent security policy would be lost. Now let's take a look at our privilege sets and see what happened. We can see that they've been essentially split, and we have what are known as system-wide privilege sets and local privilege sets. Local privilege sets have context within specific locations within the actual system, like geographic locations and network items. So they have a context in the sense of that's a place that someone can go and do something. And we can restrict access and grant different privileges there. System-wide are global. In other words, they're typically things that globally affect the entire system. They don't have context in just one particular place, but rather they affect the entire system. So let's keep that in mind as we're assigning our privilege sets. And when we go to the geographic tree and we start assigning privilege sets at different places, we're really going to be assigning local privilege sets. Let's take a look at what I mean. I'm going to go to the geographic tree right now, and we're going to look at the privileges. And what we can see is all of these operators, okay, have privilege sets associated with them. Now these are all local privilege sets. Anything that has been assigned system-wide isn't listed here because it's just assumed you can do it anywhere. That's why it's called system-wide. So we're really just looking at the local privilege sets here, okay? And now what web control has done is when it split those privilege sets up, it moved everyone to the root of the system and gave them all the existing privileges that they had before we switched. In other words, anything I could do before we switched, I can still do. And the reason for that is as follows. If I have a system administrator privilege set at the root, it's going to cascade down. It's hierarchical in nature, and every place that I navigate to, I will have those same privileges. Now there's a way to restrict that, and we're going to talk about it in a moment, but remember the rule that privilege sets flow down through the system. Now, let's go and let's say that in the Atlanta area on the rooftop, we only want 2 people really to have access to that. We want Jim Smith and we want the system administrator to be able to do things on the rooftop. We're fine with everyone else's privileges everywhere else in the system, but this rooftop in the Atlanta area, for whatever reason, we want to restrict access. Now what we can see is, in fact, that yes, all of these privilege sets are being inherited from above. Remember, these are the same things that we had at the root, and they're just flowing out to the entire system. Well, what I could do is deselect this checkbox, and now none of the privilege sets from the Prestige Corporation are getting to the rooftop. They're cascading everywhere else, but we've stopped them. What we have to do then is we have to add the administrator account back and grant it its privilege set. And then we would go ahead and add Jim Smith and give him the appropriate privilege set, which in this case happens to be control technician. And now we've essentially restricted everyone else in the whole, everyone else in the operator list from getting to this rooftop, although they retain their same privileges everywhere in the system. And we could go ahead and do the same thing in California. So for instance, let's say California, we wanted only, let's say Fred Johnson and the system administrator have access to that area. I could go ahead and deselect this and then simply add the administrator with the appropriate privileges, okay, as well as Fred Johnson with his appropriate privileges. And again, those privileges can vary. So for instance, Fred Johnson might be controls technician in California, but in Georgia have only view only. Okay, so we can kind of mix and match the privilege sets and the operators based on location. And that's essentially how we're going to restrict access to different parts of the system. Now, because in a large system with lots of operators, this can be kind of cumbersome or confusing. In other words, you might have 20 operators in 50 different buildings. You may want to know who can do what where. And that's why we have this reports tab. Now I could go to the security assignments report, or I could use the drop-down report, security assignments, and this will only show up if you have location-dependent security enabled. Let's give myself some room here, and I'm going to go ahead and run it. I could run it for certain operators, of course, but I want to see what all operators can do, and remember where we're located. Okay, we're located in California. So the only people who have access to California are the system administrator and Fred Johnson, and this is the privilege set that they have access to. However, if I went to the Prestige Corporation and ran the same report, I would expect to see all of the operators, okay, and here we can see them all. And note what happened. In California, we're still ignoring, and it still tells you which two operators have which privileges, and the same thing for Atlanta is true. So if you run this report from the root of the system, you're going to have a complete breakdown of who can do what, where. Hello. In the last session, we saw how to restrict certain operators from going to certain places in the system. And that's pretty commonly done with location-dependent security. But now we're going to talk about granting an operator greater privileges as they get deeper into the system, sort of expanding their area of responsibility as they drill deeper into the system. And a very common use case for this is as follows. Let's say that I'm managing the accounts for the Prestige Corporation, and the Atlanta guy tells me, listen, we just hired a chiller mechanic, his name's John Galt, and he's great with chillers, boilers, that type of thing. And I want him to have complete access to my rooftop. However, he's new to controls and doesn't have any web control experience. We've kind of showed him a little bit. So I would like him to be able to do things like edit set points, schedules, and look at alarms for Atlanta. But what I really don't want is I don't want him to be able to do anything but view these other locations like California, Massachusetts, Michigan, etc. He doesn't even live there, first of all, he's off location. And secondly, he's new. I don't want him disrupting those particular locations and me getting a phone call from someone else. So what I'd like you to do is set this up so he can view anything in the system, just do set point schedules and alarms in Atlanta, but have complete access to the rooftop. And that's a pretty common scenario. We see that fairly often with location-dependent security. This is how you would do that. Let's start with the Prestige Corporation. Now we've made an account for John Galt, and I need to add him because right now he's not anywhere in the system. If he logged in, he can only see the My Settings page for himself. So I'm going to add him. And when I do so, I'm going to grant him a privilege set we made called view only. The only privileges are local privilege sets that say you can view the geographic tree, you can view the network tree, and you can view the logic page, and that's it. So right now, that's all he has. Because it was made at the Prestige Corporation, it will cascade down through all these different locations, and he can now navigate anywhere and see anything, but he cannot do anything anywhere. Now I will go to the Atlanta area. I'll see, of course, that his privilege set has come down. I'm going to add him again. And when I do so, I'm going to add a second local privilege set to him that's called System Operator 1. And this is a basic functionality that allows him to edit set points, schedules, and alarms. And when I click OK, even though he can only view things in these other locations, this particular privilege set in Atlanta is cascading down, and he can now edit set points, schedules, and look at alarms for anything in the Atlanta area and below. Finally, we're going to go to the rooftop, and we can see that John Galt has view only and System Operator 1, and I'm going to add him one more time, and I'm going to give him Controls Technician privilege set. And now I have all of the functionality available with this privilege set, which is basically almost everything, on the rooftop and below. He can edit set point schedules and see alarms at Atlanta and below, but he can only view the system in other locations. And that's how you would grant expanding privileges as you get deeper into a system.